There's an old saying you shouldn't talk about politics, religion, or money if you intend to keep conversations civil. And there may be some truth to that. Every election year seems to be wilder than the last. It doesn't even matter who you're voting for. If you keep up with politics in the news, you are bound to catch some crazy, unexpected, and outlandish drama, to say the least. It's virtually the only guarantee there is in the wild world of politics. It seems every side of the debate has their own 2 cents. Every word a candidate utters is picked apart and scrutinized by the media. Still, some politicians go out of their way to make waves through society through publicity stunts, inflammatory rhetoric, and bizarre attacks on their opponents. If you think this year's election is bizarre, you should take a gander at some of the wacky, sensational, off-the-wall highlights of presidential elections from times past. It certainly isn't a new phenomenon, and the pattern will assuredly repeat itself in the future. Facts Verse presents the wildest moments in presidential elections. Before we once again dust off our history books and peer through the sands of time, make sure you remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Tap the bell icon to turn on notifications so you can keep up with all our latest facts-filled videos. George Washington had a taste for the strong stuff. Election fundraising brings in staggering amounts of cash. It's been reported President Trump has raised $426 million for his re-election campaign, and his opponent, Joe Biden, has taken in $328 million for his campaign. Those numbers are inconceivable to the average individual. There are many noble, ethical, and practical ways for a candidate to spend their campaign finances. Apparently, one of the founding fathers didn't get that memo. George Washington, as inspirational of a man as he was, reportedly once spent his entire campaign budget on 160 gallons of liquor to serve to his potential voters. With the budgets of modern-day presidential candidates, can you imagine if Joe or the Donald were to spend their entire piggy banks on booze? That likely would result in enough alcohol to get every last American drunk as a skunk. Thomas Jefferson once gave his opponent John Adams a slanderous jab in the press. The year was 1800 and it was an election year. Jefferson hired a writer in secret by the name of James Callender to publish disparaging comments about his political adversary. Callender referred to Adams in print as a hermaphroditical character who lacked the force of man or the gentleness of a woman. Talk about a scathing blow. That wasn't the end of James Callender's historical notoriety, however. He was thrown in jail for insurrection a few years later. Everyone has a voice? We've come a long way since the founding of the nation in terms of voting rights. Of course, it's well known that women and people of color have historically had to fight for the right to vote. But there is one other qualifying factor that is sometimes overlooked that impeded people's ability to have their voices be heard. Up until 1856, it was a requirement to own property if you wanted to cast your ballot. Still yet, that only granted white men the ability to vote, but it was still a step in the right direction when this requirement was lifted. North Carolina was the last state to require property ownership as a requirement for voting. Hey, quick question, did you ever get around to liking this video and subscribing to our channel? Non-white men given voting rights. In 1870, Congress gave non-white men the right to vote by means of the 15th Amendment. This was a momentous victory for equality in America. Of course, the constitutional amendment wouldn't suddenly give everyone universal equal treatment. States still had the right to decide who could vote in their elections. It wasn't until the abolishing of Jim Crow laws in the 1960s that African American voting rights were no longer contested by much of the South and parts of the North that had made it virtually impossible for black people to have their votes counted. The first female to run for president in the United States. Victoria Woodhull ran for president in 1872. She was a member of the Equal Rights Party. Her running mate was abolitionist Frederick Douglass, and he was the first African American to run for vice president. Granted, few in the world of politics or in the media took their campaigns seriously, and Woodhull was also under 35 when she ran, which disqualifies for eligibility even under today's requirements. As such, many historians don't consider her to be the first woman to legitimately run for president. It is, however, notable she ran for president 50 years before the 19th Amendment was signed, giving women the right to vote in the presidential elections. Grant ran against a dead man. Ulysses S. Grant's opponent was Horace Greeley, who was a member of the liberal Republican Party. Incidentally, he also helped coin the term Republican. Greeley's wife passed away while he was on the campaign trail, and he became very depressed and sick because of his grief. He passed away just 5 days before the Electoral College met to finalize the results of the election. In terms of popular vote, Grant had already won by a landslide anyway. Andrew Jackson won the popular vote in 1824. But he still lost the election because he received less than 50% of the electoral votes. John Quincy Adams ended up winning the presidency that year. Jackson actually received 42.3% of the votes, in contrast with Adams's 31.6%. This issue has repeated itself several times throughout election history, most recently playing out in the 2016 election between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, leading many to express vocal support for eliminating the Electoral College, which obviously is a wildly polarizing issue on its own. In total, the presidential election has been decided by the Electoral College 4 times when the popular vote sided with another candidate. Native American voting rights. Native American people won citizenship and thus were granted the federal right to vote in 1924, when President Calvin Coolidge signed the Indian Citizenship Act, which was also known as the Snyder Act. This might sound like a victory for Native people, but it really wasn't. The act was designed to break apart the Native nations and forcibly assimilate them into American society. Native Americans as a whole wouldn't be granted universal voting rights in every state until the 1960s. Voting from space. If you thought the whole voting by mail thing down on Earth was confusing, can you imagine how it feels to vote from space on the International Space Station? Americans on board are able to vote via secure email. The Tilden Controversy. In 1876, in one of the biggest election upsets in history, not only did Samuel Tilden win the popular vote, he also had a majority of the votes and not just a plurality. That didn't matter because Rutherford B. Hayes beat him by 1 electoral vote. That was the closest and arguably the most contentious election in American history. Bush versus Gore. On election night in 2000, news networks initially reported that Gore had won Florida with its 25 electoral votes. Then they retracted that in favor of Bush, only to retract that projection as well. Florida Secretary of State Katherine Harris then certified the Florida count, which inevitably led to a recount that proceeded to play out over the course of the next several weeks. The recount was the subject of the Supreme Court case Bush versus Gore, where the matter was finally settled. The court ruled that the recount was unconstitutional. The state of Florida's electoral votes were then given to Bush, resulting in his count being 271, one higher than the threshold required to win the Electoral College. Gore had received 266 votes and subsequently made his concession speech. Kennedy versus Nixon. There have been accusations for decades about the 1960 election. It's almost an accepted fact in some circles that Kennedy stole the election from Nixon. The conspiracy theory states that Kennedy had operatives in Texas and Illinois fix the tally somehow, and that in an effort to keep the unity of the nation, Nixon opted not to question the results. The irony is, if there was any truth to the idea, then it would put Kennedy, who was widely beloved by the masses, in the position of being a crook, foreshadowing the crimes that Nixon would later commit with the Watergate scandal not too many years in the future. What we do know is the race was indeed a close one. In fact, it was the closest election in the 20th century in terms of the popular vote. Kennedy received only 113,000 more votes than Nixon. J. Edgar Hoover firmly believed Nixon was the rightful winner of the election, and so did a whole slew of conservative journalists, politicians, and commentators at the time. Nixon, however, was the most prominent believer of election fraud being the reason for his loss. It's reported that at a 1960 Christmas party, he greeted all of his guests by saying, "We won, but they stole it from us." Controversial voting machines. People have a historic aversion to change, especially when that change involves some kind of new technology. Despite what you might have suspected, though, the first voting machine was used in an election in 1892. The machine itself had been invented years earlier as well. Women's suffrage. The first European nation to implement women's suffrage was Finland in 1906. Women in the U.S. were awarded the valuable right to vote in 1920 when the 19th Amendment was added to the Constitution. The first woman to be nominated by a major political party for president was Hillary Clinton in 2016, although she would go on to lose in yet another contentious and divisive election. There's a good chance you're getting pretty tired of hearing about the election, but this upcoming one is certainly looking to be one of the most polarizing and controversial ones in modern history. Despite all the partisan divisiveness, just remember your neighbors are people just like you. And regardless of the outcome of the election, take solace in the fact that it's not the first time that it's felt more like a circus than a political process. Now it's time to hear from you. Some say elections should be decided by the popular vote, while others see the Electoral College as a means for rural America and smaller states to still have their voices be heard on a federal level. Do you like the Electoral College, or would you like to see it done away with? Let us know what you think in the comments section. And before you go, make sure you like this video and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. Tap the bell icon to turn on notifications so you can keep up with all of our latest content.